standing in a sweltering marketplace surrounded by the cacophony of voices and traders, the enslaved people of antiquity found themselves in Athens. Lost, tired, and barely comprehending a word, before them the watchful eyes of vendors. Looking to their left and right, the slaves would see Greeks and many foreign faces they'd never seen before, and not all stood to face the same fate. The vendors at the slave market would have a specific eye for the youngest males who stood before them. In ancient Greece, not only was it normalized for men to have relationships with boys, it was a part of life. Held was the idea that an older man could impart wisdom and education to a younger boy whom he appropriately courted. Little did the young boys standing at the slave market know, their entire lives could change should the wealthiest of vendors take to them. Their lowliest status as a slave could transform into the prized property of the affluent. Welcome to History on Fleek. Today we examine the worst-kept secret of concubines in ancient Greece. The first records of male concubines can be found in writings in ancient Greece and Rome. Commonly known in antiquity as catamites, from the Latin katamitos, the term covered an intimate relationship between an adult male and a pubescent boy. Since antiquity, previous cultures would take a young boy into the household, where he would serve as a sexual partner for the head of the house and other men of the house. The catamite could also be used as a servant or an entertainer for the household. While this is wholly appalling to today's sensibilities, and rightfully so, times long before this one held no shame in the practice. In a world of little social or legal ramifications, keeping male concubines was part and parcel of ancient society. Though most likely found in the palaces of rulers and the lavish homes of the wealthiest merchants, keeping concubines was a matter of money. They could be owned by the commoners who could afford them. Ancient texts speak of male concubines and the social attitudes around them significantly. While normalized and littered throughout mythology, look no further than Zeus's abduction of Ganymede, the pretty Trojan youth, there was also a stigma present. Pior delicatus was a Latin colloquialism for a concubine, meaning delicate boy. Yet it was also an insult when used towards an adult male. The same can be said for a catamite, a social term for the described, and an insult for any beyond. The cities of ancient Greece had male brothels as a pedestrian fact of life. City streets would have individual cabins for the purpose and were frequently visited by male clients. Male or female, the sex workers of ancient Greece were taxed on their earnings. Curiously, given the normalcy of relations with pubescents, prostitution of such was a grave offense that could incur the death sentence. In effect, an indictment for prostitution was made to make the individual a social pariah, to strip the person of any civic rights. Yet this terrain, what was a mercenary relationship, what was not, is somewhat muddy. Men and youths could have relations, and it was normalized for the older partner to buy his boy lover gifts. So, a desired young boy pursued by many admirers needed to be careful whose eyes were watching. A tainted reputation could curtail any chance at a later role in public life. Prostituted young boys could only be so in action, not in reputation, and certainly not within the nearby public perception. Typically, the male concubines of Athens were young men enslaved and often sold into a life of prostitution. Once bought by a household, they could serve as sexual partners for women and men. Yet they were predominantly in service of men. The normalcy of pederastic relationships was informed by the ancient Greek view of love and sexuality. Unlike today, these were not viewed in terms of gender, but very much in terms of power dynamics. In reality, the only forbidden or potential shame from such relationships was being the passive partner to another man. Once again, somewhat mind-blowing to our view today, but there was some kind of character-building sentiment behind pederastic unions. It would require the father of the household to approve any relationship between a boy and a man. It was believed the relationship could educate and initiate a well-off man into society. In Sparta, for example, pederasty was nigh on mandatory. A boy would be paired up with a Spartan warrior, the older warrior serving as a mentor and the younger boy a companion and sexual partner, till his elder was married off. Sexual companionship with younger boys was a rite of passage, prostitute, and a stepping stone. Charming. In antiquity, adult males pursuing a relationship with a pubescent boy had their own dynamics upheld in society. The older male pursuing the boy would be known as eromenos, and the boy in question, erastus. Today's view can only balk at such claims, and even contemporaries viewed it as aristocratic excess. Yet this relationship was declared building the intellect and morality of the youngest. Beginning such a relationship had its own uncanny dynamics too. Boys were expected to be pursued for love, to be lavished in compliments and gifts. Yet they were also expected to initially resist. More curiously, any sexual component was not there to be enjoyed by the youngest in question. Sexual contact and favors were only to be given in return for a beneficial mentoring relationship. As for that, well, just to clarify, any copulating was intercrural. Feel free to Google that word. So steeped in all things wrong, it's hard to imagine that any society ever held such attitudes, but it did. In ancient Greece, asymmetrical relationships between adult men and boys were structured and encouraged to impart knowledge, experience, and wisdom to the youth. The relationship was designed for a teacher-student dynamic, less one between lovers. For clarity, there was a normative age range for what appears a pretty abnormal practice. The pubescent boys in question would typically be between 12 and 17 years old. And you thought high school was a raw deal. Alongside the ancient Greek mishmash of readily buying and grooming youths for sexual pleasure, all whilst outlawing their prostitution, status was another matter entirely muddled. While available to anyone who could afford it, male concubines were most likely found in the company of the wealthiest. In a society avid to make displays of power, the young male concubines were regularly used as displays of status for their affluent patrons. Brought into the household of the wealthy, catamites could receive all the privileges a well-off upbringing could provide. Being trained and educated in the arts, poetry, and music was not uncommon. Keeping one's reputation well protected, even as a catamite, was all important. A young man that did not could be a social outcast, consigned to the status of an inferior and a life of prostitution. Yet a catamite that faithfully served his role to the household that bought him could find remarkable reward further down the road. A favored male concubine stood to harness a degree of social standing, if not economic power. A powerful patron in antiquity could entrust a favored concubine as an advisor. Though, as you can see, the entire placement of catamites was in a system of class and power. Without a doubt, a catamite could quite possibly end up walking the halls of power with a patron who favored him. Yet, it was a long and unlikely road to any such outcome. Ultimately, in ancient Greek society, catamites were treated as an item of luxury, and they would most be sighted only around the most powerful and wealthy. Concubines could find themselves bought into a household of comfortable living, yet there was no development of their status beyond this. In the majority, a young man who'd become a concubine to an older man had been bought out of slavery. Even if favored and beloved by the household taking them in, these concubines were not freeborn citizens, and therefore seen as socially inferior. It's clear that in the Greece of antiquity, a young man pursuing a boy to love and adorn in gifts was his vessel to heterosexual love. There is a record of Spartan women cropping their hair and dressing in male garbs at their weddings to accommodate this passage. Yet the arrival of a marriage, or just the ability to grow a beard, would usually mean the end of the pederastic relationship. While their lover and companion for years would be on to adult life, the concubine had little. They would not be allowed to marry and were viewed as property. The best a catamite could likely get was remain close to the male they'd served for years. Their lives in totality would seldom improve. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.